Well, the last speaker is Dr. Sandberg, who is a researcher at the University of Oxford in the Future of Humanity Institute. You've heard him described by some of the previous speakers as a polymath, as perhaps the happiest person around, somebody who applies some of the insights of philosophy and technology very much in his own life. He studies existential risk. He's frequently a consultant and advisor to corporations, including insurance companies, who are wondering about the future and about risks. He's also frequently a consultant and advisor to government ministers, who are also wondering about the future. So today we're going to hear Anders' views about the future of politics. Can we use technology and philosophy to improve how politics operates? So a very big round of applause for Anders Sandberg.
Thank you very much. And the microphone, does it work? Ah, excellent. Yeah, you never know. Okay, I'm going to kind of inadvertently follow a little bit of Natasha's advice here and get over in the deep end of the pool where I'm not that used to swimming. Because I'm not a political scientist and I'm not a sociologist. I'm a lapsed computational neuroscientist who hangs out in the philosophy department because they don't complain when I do weird research. But this, of course, means that I tend to think about society and government and politics from a slightly weird angle. I tend to think of it as information processing. I'm interested in what are the signals, how are they processed, how are they stored, and how can the system update itself. So this might be a slightly off approach to questions about policy, but we'll see where we end up. Some of you might have also have seen previous talks I've given and will notice that it's unusually much text in this talk. That's, of course, evidence that I'm new at this. Over a span of time, as I finally figure out what actually is going on, I'm going to remove more and more text, and eventually it's just going to be nice pictures. Okay, so this is the rough idea that I'm aiming for, and I'm not going to run out of time and rush through some parts of it anyway. So the first question is, what the heck is governance? I actually was rather confused by that, and I'm very thankful to David for kind of forcing me to actually look up the Wikipedia page, because I've been hearing it over in Oxford endlessly. It's been annoying me. Why aren't we just talking about governments? What's governance? And then I'm going to look at how technology affects this, and how some of the problems of human nature change that. And then some technologies that are emerging that might, by 2025, actually have a real impact on society. So again, for those of you who know me, this is unusually short term. There is not a single upload in this talk, as far as I know. So what is governance? Well, it turns out that the definition I found was all processes of governing, whether undertaken by government, markets, and networks, whether over a family, tribe, formal or informal organization, or territory, and whether through laws, norms, power, or language. It's wonderfully broad. It's just one of those definitions that make everybody in the philosophy department happy. But it also shows that this is more than just politics. There is governance going on in your families about what to do on a Sunday outing. There is governance going on in the department about who's going to do what job. And then that leads to the policy cycle. And I think this is a kind of nice tool from the political science world. This is the short version. There are various versions around. But basically, at first, somebody notices that there is a problem and convinces other people that there is a problem, or at least something needs to be done, or maybe not done. And then various options are proposed by various people. And these various people might, of course, include other people saying, hey, we want to be in on this. And a lot of the discussion about who actually gets to be in on the process. Finally, there is some form of decision making. A decision is made, then somebody better do it. A surprising number of decisions are made without anybody ever doing anything. And finally, and this is also something people tend to forget at an amazingly high rate, we should check whether it actually worked and solved the problem in the first place. Or even, was there a problem in the first place? Again, a surprising number of policies actually don't solve problems that exist. Now, governance has a lot of interesting issues these days. So we're having a more and more diverse population. Part of that is simply because it's a larger population. Part of it is because high tech allows us to be in contact, which means that people with very different views are in contact with each other. So we have this global transnational system. We have demographic change, where we are getting a different distribution of ages, which I don't think older people are more conservative, but we certainly have gotten used to certain institutions, and they have a vested interest in those institutions, and different generations might use different technologies differently, which, if technology affects policy, might lead to a bit of trouble. We're also getting more complex threats and situations. So this is a graph from the Afghanistan war, and when Donald Rumsfeld saw it, he said, "I have seen the enemy." This is apparently explaining what's going on. And if the threats are of this level of complexity, then we're in deep trouble. The problem is, I can go on all day actually showing you slides like this one of various important things in the world, because yes, a lot of stuff is very interconnected and interdependent. Similarly, we have extreme priorities. Quite a lot of problems, when you look at them, the most important thing is orders of magnitude more important than the second most important thing. So we have a lot of nice work being done in the world of effective altruism, looking at this for helping the world. And it's really awesome, and it was eye-opening to me to realize that, oh, there are many orders of magnitude of difference between how effective different charities are. Not because they're wasting money or anything, but simply because different interventions have really different effects. Also, this means that thinking carefully about what problem to try to solve first can pay off enormously. And finally, of course, we have this problem that bad governance can be really bad. This is a graph you probably can't read from the World Economic Forum's risk report. And that little orange thing down there in the center, that's global governance failure. This is various global risks which are really bad. And that's the one risk that everything seems to link into, because if you mess up your governance, then a lot of other things are also going to get messed up. So we better get that one right. And finally, there is another reason. This is probably my only doom and gloom slide, actually, which is, again, slightly unusual for me. I'm a very gleeful doomster. But this is one of the best documented piece of data in sociology, that wars and the military conflicts have a size distribution that's a power law. This was established by Richardson back in the 40s, and more data has just supported it. We can quibble a little bit about frequencies, etc. But basically, this suggests that very big wars, they're rare, but they occur at a disturbing frequency. So now if we move this up and extrapolate the curves a bit, this is the world population. And you can actually calculate a rough probability of a war that could wipe us all out. And unfortunately, it's not a super low number. It's not 10 to the minus 23 or something like that. It's actually a number with just 3 or 4 digits. That's disturbing. We might argue, maybe there is some cutoff, maybe there are other ways of dealing with this. But if you look at the data, it seems that bad governance actually has killed people in big disasters at a rate that seems to be quite on par with the big pandemics and epidemics. Again, there are some statistical issues which are fun to deal with, but obviously bad governance kills. So, what can we do about it? Well, one of the cool things is that social systems are information limited. If you don't have writing, your code of law has to be some kind of rhyming verse passed down at the campfire by the elders to the young people. It can't be too long, because then people are going to forget the paragraph 517 about the disposition of feathers after light fowl hunting. However, if you get writing, you can get that paragraph into it. So it's not a coincidence that as soon as we get writing, we'd start getting codes of law, which can be more or less elaborate. They also have a tendency to grow larger and larger. So as writing becomes cheaper, you can make more copies. And this enables more complicated formal systems. Now, suppose you went back in time to ancient Egypt and introduced the wonders of parliamentary democracy. You couldn't actually get them to run it, even if all the Egyptians agreed that that was a wonderful idea. Simply because you couldn't distribute the party manifesto. You need a printing press to do that. You need some degree of literacy, some degree of easy reproduction of information in order to run a parliamentary democracy. Where printing presses just to disappear today, and the similar counterparts, we couldn't actually run Westminster. We would have to go back to some kind of code of law and probably put up in the cathedral. Similarly, when we add broadcasting, now you can do a mass democracy. You can tell everybody at the same time what we ought to be doing or feeling, which has again led to some innovations in governments and innovations, of course, in warfare and other stuff. These processes take time. So the innovation of printing in the West happened in the 1400s. Yet over the next 300 years, if you actually go to a political scientist and ask what happened in governance, he's going to give you a detailed history about innovations of other kinds. Like complicated election rules, like in Venice. They developed a really elaborate system in order to make sure no coalition could cheat the system. How to make a committee work. There is a kind of technology of committee work. It might not look particularly impressive because there are no metal parts, but actually, without that technology, you cannot get committees to function. Civil servants, again, there are traditions, there are ideas of profession that you need to put in. This took several centuries to develop. There were certain other technologies like chimneys that actually played a role in this process, but it took quite a while to get up to that level set even by the printing press. So this is, of course, why the internet, the latest technology, why we shouldn't expect to have any technology that makes sense yet, or rather any governance technology that makes use of it properly yet. We haven't had it long enough. We might be innovating faster than ever, but it's still going to be a noticeable lag. If you look at the experts in political science, we also try to apply a bit of innovation thinking. I find the papers mildly boring, but they point out that it's not just about the products and processes. You might also change what government is. You can change the boundaries, you can make other people deputize them, make them part of government, or use your technology to change how we feel about it. The nudge unit here in the UK, for example, had been trying to get us to be a bit more virtuous by nudging things in the right direction. Now, what technologies do we need to develop? Well, the main problem is groups of humans are really good at solving certain kinds of problems. So smoothing out biases, if we make guesses and take the average, that is typically fairly good. If I'm giving you all a problem that once you find a solution, everybody can agree that's a solution, you're also going to do much better than the smartest guy or girl in this room. If I give you the question, solve the Middle East, this is a vexed problem. It's not even clear what the solution properly would be. You would probably not find anything very useful. It actually turns out that it's probably better to have each of you write a little paper about it in isolation, and then I collect them and try to find a good idea among them. It seems like some problems don't scale very well. Another issue is that the more people you have in your group, the more communication we need to do. That means eventually we can't do any work because we just communicated with each other. The end result known as bureaucracy. The interesting thing is, of course, if you organize yourself in the right way, you can actually get a lot more work done. You divide yourself into subgroups and they carefully send messages to each other in order not to waste too much time. Again, this is a form of innovation. And any technology that changes how cheap it is to distribute information might, of course, enable you changes in group sizes. So I think this is a very interesting example of how the internet has already allowed us to do enormous projects like open source software that are far beyond any individual ability, simply because it became so cheap to communicate. If you can find other ways of reducing this friction, you can get larger and smarter groups. And then, of course, the problem that some groups do the opposite. I've been looking a little bit at jury members, and it seems that the jury system is probably one of the most stupid ways you can use in order to determine the guilt or not of somebody. But we have it for traditional reasons. It's very hard to avoid. And of course, markets famously have all sorts of bubbles and overconfidence. It even turns out that the Human Development Index is inversely proportional to the size of number of ministers in the government for various nations. Probably because the more ministers you have, the more time they spend in meetings rather than solving the real problems. Now, this leads to interesting things about thinking about social media. So we have developed media that allow us to transmit information very effectively. So that's important both for opinion formation, telling people that something has happened or what you feel about it. And then there is a distribution of ideas or discussion. What should we be doing about it for the later stages? And different media have very different abilities. Twitter is not the same thing as a blog or television for spreading them. I don't have the time to get into all the interesting things that happen. For example, when you have micro-expertise, on Facebook you can actually probably find a friend who is a lawyer who can relatively quickly give you an answer and give you legal advice in order to settle your opinions. That means that expertise actually might be spreading much more quickly on the micro scale. There are interesting issues of micro-teaching. And then, of course, a lot of governments who don't like it which is why in Turkey right now the most popular graffiti is DNS servers and ways of getting onto Twitter. Which is interesting because now graffiti has become a social media supporting the internet. So I don't have the time to really get into it, but basically what happens in a lot of these media is that there is a self-organizing process that makes these cascades of information spreading from person to person become more and more effective over time, which is really awesome. The problem is, of course, not all of this produces intelligence. I don't have the time to get through all this lovely crowdsourcing, because we can also generate cascades of disinformation. I'm right now in one of them, where there was an interview with the lead author of our paper that was slightly misreported by the Daily Mail, and then the Telegraph read the Daily Mail, and now, by now, already at that point, the Oxford researchers, who are no longer even philosophers, but researchers, are having some kind of time dilation pill. And then Slashdot reports about it, that, oh yes, Oxford researchers are suggesting that we give prisoners a time dilation pill to give them 1,000-year crime sentences. That's kind of bad. And the interesting problem about it is that we want to control, of course, the amount of noise in this discussion. And the problem is every step we do in these networks means that there is a certain amount of noise introduced and a certain amount of bias. Some people are deliberately biasing things. A lot of people just accidentally bias things because they report things that are interesting. That's going to bias in certain directions. Or unusual. That's going to bias in certain directions. Or agree with what we think, which is, of course, certainly going to bias a lot of it. So the problem is the more steps you have, the more bias you get. One of the good things about broadcasting media is it's just one giant bias at the transmitter. In the case of a blogosphere, you can actually do 100 jumps and suddenly the views are really strange and not what you originally intended. We can resolve this by reputation to stabilize this online situation, but they also have some interesting problems. Still, I don't have the time to get into it. There are some interesting questions about the equality of reputation. In principle, it seems like a world run on a reputation would be just as unequal as a world run on a capital. Actually, reputations seem to have the same the Gini coefficient as the American income distribution. But at least it's separate from that. Unfortunately, it's also separate from merit. You can kind of show that people's reputation don't correlate that strongly with how good they are at stuff. But we now have technology that are starting to use this nascent technology of stigmergy. Stigmergy is a kind of a cool-sounding biological concept about how our actions change our environment, and that changes further actions. So when you have a lot of bees milling around, and they will build honeycombs that are going to force bees to mill around in a certain way, which is helping them organize more honeycombs. Same thing for ants or corals, or for that manner, humans organizing themselves on the tube. We don't have a good science of this, because we haven't only been doing this for a few years. We certainly have a lot of companies, but most of these ones, most of these applications are, of course, going to go bust. But we're learning. We're learning fast, and that means that in the future we should expect a lot of these technologies to be much better. Also, again, I don't have the time to get into the wonderful and horrifying world of modeling, but it's essentially running the world today. If you go to the city, everybody will tell you in a solemn voice, all models are wrong, but some are useful. That's a quote from Cox, one of the big statisticians. And we all say it in the same tone, which tells you that their professor was very solemn when he told it to them. And they all think they have learned it. What, of course, happens is things like a financial crash when they start believing the models too much. Or you have problems where we can't agree on how much we believe in different models. The interesting thing is we're getting to a point where we have data to feed into them to actually make really big models that are running on the real data rather than just a few data points. With the Internet of Things, you can actually try to run it on a reality. That still doesn't tell you what the model should be, and different versions of the model might produce quite different outcomes. One interesting possibility is actually try to run all of them and get these scenarios. Because if you just choose one, you end up in a turf war between the people who would like the conclusion type A model and type B models give you. If you instead can just have a discussion, okay, given this, which one do we believe the most, or what policy makes sense given both type A and type B models? Also big data, which we have been hyping to no end. It's of course at the top of its hype curve, and now it's time to start dissing big data quite a lot. One of the interesting things is that it's big input that we might want to look at. Where is the data coming from? Does it go to a big centralized thing, or does it get distributed? That's going to determine the applications we can do. The government certainly wants to try to organize its data in the G-Cloud, although they seem to have missed the idea of a cloud being something that's easily movable and doesn't have borders, but instead wanted to lock it up rather nicely so particular applications can use it. There are some interesting issues here when you start combining that with Watson technology and try to improve the civil service that way. I don't have the time either to get into my colleagues, Carl and Michael's wonderful paper about what jobs are threatened. One of the things I noticed in the list of occupation is they didn't actually have any government jobs in there, as far as I could easily see. I think a lot of government jobs are in this section, the ones most likely to replace, because the jobs that are in danger are those that can be done by big data, that are routine, that don't require manual dexterity, creative intelligence, or social intelligence. Certainly a lot of other important things that is done in government definitely require these things. But there is a lot of bureaucracy that is kind of under threat, and it's going to try to defend itself, or it has to reinvent itself. So we're going to see a lot of interesting pressure, both from the below and from above, to actually invent new forms of organization. I'm just rushing through this, but to get to my point here, where I think these technologies are pushing us in 10 years' time. So on the agenda setting part is, big data is wonderful for finding answers once you have a question. But artificial intelligence is really bad at coming up with good questions. That's one area where humans over the next 10 years are totally going to rule, and I'm rather confident about that prediction. Later on, once we get the AGI, then it's different. But this means that actually big data is really good if you come up with, and open data initiatives are good. Simulations are also good to show that there is an issue. You can simulate things and show, if this goes on, we're going to end up here, and this is horrifying. We better do something. Of course, the simulation can be wrong or stupid, like the Club of Rome simulation. It still works really well for agenda setting. It's also interesting that diverse groups of stakeholders are really good at finding very different problems and pointing them out. Unfortunately, they're also going to be competing. So you're going to see some political technologies for competing with other stakeholder groups, which is a bit annoying because that's kind of a zero-sum game. Can we make our policies better? One thing that is kind of very popular, at least around the internet, where I'm hanging out, is the Icelandic constitution, where we more or less put it up and allowed the public to comment and essentially did a wiki democracy. It was eventually decided in the normal way at the Althing, but they actually opened it up in a new way. Again, we have abilities stemming from large diverse groups. We can test policy options to a new way. And we're getting interesting tools like the one the Pirate Party and others are developing for decision-making. Decision-making, however, is tricky because by now we're having this debate on who gets to make the decision. And we have a lot of gridlock, especially on the highest international level. So one of the things the Oxford Martin School is kind of pushing for is sometimes maybe you don't need to get everybody in the United Nations to agree. Let's just get a coalition of working together. So at least we, in our group, we're going to try to solve this. And this works probably well for some aspects of computer security. You get local alliances. Then others might see, oh, that's a good idea, and join if it's juicy enough. Probably where we should be working is developing better tools for strengthening our decision, reducing our cognitive biases, finding more clever ways of combining preference, and maybe even ways of implementing rights in our code. Because it's quite easy to use code to control behavior, which is what nudge units like. However, we might also put in code in our governments that makes it more likely for them to respect rights. Implementing, again, there are interesting and sometimes super futuristic ideas like futurity that's probably never going to get implemented, but are still an interesting thought experiment. We might even automate some policy implementation. If the law passes, software makes sure it happens. Finally, the most important part perhaps, actually getting evidence back. We have evidence-based policy in this country, which typically means that evidence that fits the preconceptions of the politicians, that gets cited. But you could actually imagine making sure the public actually keeps an eye on the politicians and hold them to it. There is another really clever thing, and that's, of course, do randomized controlled trials. Again, this is something where in the UK is actually world leading. It has the only report that points out this eminently simple idea that some policies we don't know whether A and B is best, randomize and try it. This is never going to be applied, of course, to anything where people have a big stake. It's going to be small stuff, but we can start from there. Similarly, surveillance, of course, goes both ways, and we might maybe add automatic auditing. That's going to be controversial. To end, thinking about policymaking as software, of course, makes you aware that stuff goes wrong all the time. One of the benefits of an open society is that we can talk about that there is a bug or problem here. We can discuss whether it actually is a problem, and we can correct it. Closed societies don't do that. Democracy per se is not the important thing of an open society. Whether we're voting or not doesn't matter as much as we can actually fix things one way or another. And one of the interesting lessons from software is it's hard to fix bugs that occur very rarely, even if they're really nasty big bugs. So if the mean time between failures is longer than the time you're watching the system, you're not going to see it. In software, we solve it by having loads of beta testers. We can't do that with a political system. But we might want to have small-scale systems, especially if the bugs tend to show up quickly because people can benefit from it. Malicious users and hackers are your friends as long as they don't overwhelm you. We need to debug our epistemic social systems so the noise doesn't win out. And we might actually want to figure out better ways of adaptive setting the learning rate of our systems. That's some small ideas. But generally, my view is rather optimistic. I think we're going to have a smarter policy in 2025. The problem is, of course, what kind of smart? Human smart or artificial smart or Twitter smart? We don't know yet. Thank you.
Let's take some questions. Ben?
Thank you, Anders. That was great. It was really enjoyable. I don't know if you're familiar with the psychologist Paul Slovic, but Slovic has sort of studied our reactions to individual suffering versus genocides or larger problems. Do you see these sort of systems as being able to resolve decisions about things we may care less about, like, for example, huge genocides, by definition, worse problems, and sort of almost correcting that bias that you talk about? Mm.
I don't think correcting biases deep down is a software problem. We need to kind of solve the psychological problem first and then figure out how to implement in software or laws or plastic or whatever medium it actually works for. So some of these biases are much worse than others. And this kind of general inability to handle large numbers is, of course, constantly making a lot of policies totally ridiculous, because we don't want to, we don't care about the priorities well enough, so we allow small things to get priority over large ones, especially if it's a loud group supporting the small thing. I think the cognitive bias research is very, very helpful. At least these days, Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is kind of lying around on the bedside tables a lot of places in the city. That might still take 10 years or 20 years before those people who actually read and understand it, rather than just have it, will get into positions of power, because there is always a great deal of delay. But I'm rather optimistic about it. But we need to kind of constantly point out that public governance should be rational. At the very least, whatever we ever believe, it should be rational about it. You don't want faith-based governance in the sense that, oh, I'm just going to do it and hope for the best. No, you want rational reasons for what you do.
Thank you for your talk, which I found illuminating, particularly as I am a policy researcher in the civil service.
Great.
But my question to you is, how does ideology fit in? Do you think it's insignificant?
Ideologies... They're essentially cognitive systems, very big explanations of what's going on. People rarely switch completely from one to another, although that does happen. But then the kind of ideology you can have is very much shaped by the system you're working in. So if you take a classic Marxist view, it wouldn't work at all in a feudal society. It wouldn't even make sense. It only works in an industrial society that has some kind of roughly size of a national state. Whether it would work in a globalized post-industrial world, I have serious doubts about it. But there are probably other ideologies that are going to pop up. And of course, people tend to buy into ideologies much more than is actually rational. Ideally, I should be told a theory about the economy, and I should judge that compared to the others, and I should select one, and then I should switch depending on evidence. But what typically happens is, of course, as soon as I buy one view of economy, I might suddenly start to get opinion about climate change, which is totally crazy when you think about it. But things tend to come bundled, and this is human psychology. So I think this is part of the irrationality we cannot easily avoid without changing ourselves radically. But at least making sure that the ideologies don't hijack the system. I think that's important, actually adding enough flexibility to the system so it can adapt and allow minority views to come in. I think that's a good way of diffusing the worst dangers of ideology.
Hi, thank you, Anders. Great talk. In this last slide, you mentioned handle malicious users. How do you handle malicious administrators? Particularly when they can sideload their agendas to bias the system delivery in their favor?
In a sense, computer security is to some degree struggling with this too. After all, not all administrators of computers are trustworthy. Some of them might actually want to steal the password file or steal the money from the bank. So at least on the software side, we have some ideas about it. The traditional answer in an open society is, of course, you detect that an administrator is front-loading stuff and doing stuff evilly, and then we criticize him in the news media. That might not always work, because sometimes these crimes or malicious behaviors are subtle, or just so boring to explain that nobody will bother Twitter or blog about it. The only other people who read the blog are equally boring people who also care about small or matters of war. What we might do is, however, try to create systems that detect these things and make it more clear. For example, reporting on the healthiness of restaurants in New York. If you do a little bit of statistics from the city data, it's very clear that health inspectors are nudging numbers. You can't prove which health inspector is actually nudging which restaurant's number up or down, but you can prove that it's going on, and you can make a fuss about it. I think we can build systems that make it easier to make a fuss about this kind of bad behavior.
Hi, just a question. In regards to programming, it's relatively obvious when there's a failure. But in regards to policy making, how do you actually measure and recognize failure to politicians?
Yeah. So maybe we should actually start demanding that politicians also explain what they aim to what they intend, what the end result of a policy should be. That is not enough, of course, because they can always say, well, the reason my policy failed was not because it's a bad policy, but well, things happened in Iraq, and the weather was bad, and it was the wrong kind of leaves on the train tracks. So it's very hard to assign blame. This is a classic robotics problem, and I think it's even worse in policy making. But it's also better in the sense that you can actually look at details in a richer way. You can actually try to make an opinion and investigate, well, was that really the wrong kind of leaves on the train track? Can we get data about it? So one of the things I'm very much in favor is the kind of open data initiatives where you get data. And ideally, maybe every supposed bill or a study should actually have some list of its assumptions and preconditions. Of course, it might be hard to get politicians and the bureaucrats to write them, but it might be possible to actually generate it from the text. It might be possible to develop taxonomies to actually figure this out, if not completely automatically, at least partially you can get help. But I think, indeed, it's a very tricky question, what actually constitutes a really failed policy. Quite often it's the side effects rather than that the policy doesn't reach its aim that are the real problem.
Anders, I want to take you back to the work we did with the Home Office a couple of years ago on the scenarios for the future of narcotics. If you remember, we came up with scenarios that said 2030, the most likely delivery mechanisms were either the maker community, big companies basically producing legal highs, or the likes of Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony using electronic delivery platforms. And you recall all of the experts kind of bought into those.
And then when we took them to the policymakers, they went, F off. You know, you haven't mentioned Jamaicans, Albanians or Colombians. And that's, you know, where current policy is. And you just couldn't get them to move beyond the current day issues. So how do you overcome that bias around the present when thinking about the longer term?
Yeah, I think that's a general problem. And the problem is, of course, as we've been discussing quite often, even the public has a kind of anchoring in the here and now, which is not always a bad thing to have. Setting an adaptivity rate is a tricky problem. I have been actually playing around with a bit of simulations of that recently, and I think it can be done. But deep down, it might be that actually create institutions that do a better job than the existing ones and show them up. Demonstrate that, look, we predicted this, we made money from it, and we suggested really good local policies. At least in our little community, things are fine. That would be really devastating to a lot of the existing incumbent institutions. The interesting thing is, of course, you can also use this technology to scale up your results and document them in interesting ways. And of course, since a lot of these experiments are actually going to totally fail, you can document the failures and learn from that, which is even more relevant.
Anders Sandberg, polymath, transhumanist, philosopher par excellence, thank you very much.
Thank you.